But I will anyway, because that's what academics do. They go on and on, even when it's not necessary. They flog dead horses. So let's just examine, let's just think about that claim. It was just an error and nothing more. Suppose one of the organizers of this event were to pop up right now and say, unfortunately, Graeme MacQueen fell and hurt his knee on the way here today, and that's why he's just collapsed and died. Hopefully some of you would point out that I haven't collapsed and died. I'm here. Well, then we would have to ask, what kind of a peculiar situation was that? What do we make of that announcement? Now, so far, we probably would agree that it was an error, albeit a bizarre error. It's a bizarre error, not only because I'm still standing, but because hurting your knee doesn't normally lead to you collapsing and dying. Nonetheless, we might pass it off. But supposing 20 minutes later, I did collapse and die at the podium, then the situation has completely changed, hasn't it? Now, we still have error. There was an error in the timing of the announcement. But we also have tremendous accuracy. We have truth being communicated. And when I say tremendous accuracy, that's because my collapsing and dying could not apparently have been predicted through what happened to me. You see the point? If you were a police investigator trying to figure out why I collapsed and died, don't you think you'd have some pretty tough questions for that person who popped up and said I had already collapsed and died? Now, some of you may think it's a bad analogy, because after all, people don't normally die when they hurt their knee, whereas this building was clearly on fire, and surely that's a more natural thing to expect it's collapsed, but it isn't. You've been told this before, but I'm going to say it again. This direct quotation from the NIST report, you should paste on your foreheads. It's so important. This was the first known instance of the total collapse of a tall building primarily due to fires. We could put it more powerfully. This is the first time in history that a building like this has come down from fires. This is a unique, unprecedented, and therefore unpredictable event. So if it was fishy to somehow think I was going to collapse and die because I'd hurt my knee, it was even fishier to expect that this building would come down simply because it was on fire. Now, I want to stop and make a little distinction here that may be a bit pedantic and unnecessary, but I want to take my time with this. If you were that police investigator looking into my death, you would be asking tough questions, because at some point you would understand the difference between two types of foreknowledge. One we might call evidence-based foreknowledge, and the other we might call action-based foreknowledge. Evidence-based foreknowledge is when you see you observe something, study it, measure it, whatever, and you find evidence that rationally leads you to conclude that something for sure is going to happen. You gain your foreknowledge through the study of the evidence. Action-based foreknowledge is when you know something's going to happen because you're darn well going to make it happen. It's the human will and human action that brings it about. Now, that's quite a common form of foreknowledge. We know about things that are going to happen in the future because we're going to do them, or people we know are going to do them. There's nothing inherently fishy about it, but it becomes fishy when we pretend it's something else. So the investigator, looking into my death, would consider the possibility that the person that said I had already collapsed was maybe an extremely skilled physician, good at prognosis, sees all the signs, knows I'm going to die, and just jumps the gun a little. That would be a legitimate evidence-based foreknowledge. But the investigator will also consider the possibility that perhaps the person who talked about me collapsing had poisoned my coffee that morning. In other words, had done something which led them to know that that was going to happen. Excuse me for having to kind of go through these distinctions, but they're important because my main contention, my argument, is that NIST has tried again and again and again, first of all, to ignore the foreknowledge of Building 7. But when it finds itself unable to avoid the topic, it tries to present it all as prognosis, as the evidence-based estimation that something is going to happen. Whereas I'm claiming it can't be. The evidence is such that that cannot be true. That what is true is that it's action-based foreknowledge. People knew that building was coming down because somebody had determined to bring it down. That's my argument. Now, of course, you would expect those tough questions that were asked of the person who predicted my death to be asked of the BBC. Did the FBI or the 9/11 Commission or NIST ask tough questions of the BBC? As far as we know, they did not. As far as I know, they did not ask tough questions of any of the individuals or groups or agencies that had foreknowledge of the collapse of World Trade Center. And that tells you something about the quality of the investigation. Now, I'd like to back up for a moment and start defining a couple of terms. I've talked about foreknowledge, but I haven't told you what it is. And it turns out that this is quite important to what I want to say today. I'm taking a standard definition of foreknowledge from Merriam-Webster's Third International Dictionary. Foreknowledge is knowledge of a thing before it happens or exists. Knowledge, it's a form of knowledge. And I'm going to try and distinguish this from other kinds of awareness that we have of the future, because we all live in some degree of awareness of our futures and our past. And we have a broad array of terms that we use when we talk about our awareness of the future. Prediction, forecast, prescience, hunch, all kinds of terms that we use. But foreknowledge is a very specific term and a very specific concept. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are three major elements that are crucial if we're going to use the term foreknowledge. Certainty, confirmation, and detail. Certainty is a state of the knower, of the person doing the knowing, how you feel. You feel certain. You feel confident, free from doubt or uncertainty. Confirmation is not a quality of the knower, but of the events in the world. The thing that you think is going to happen has to happen. Otherwise, we don't call it knowledge. You could be convinced something is going to happen, you could be certain, but if it doesn't happen, we don't call it knowledge, and we don't call it foreknowledge. And finally, detail. Maybe that one's a little trickier, so let me pause on that. If someone were to say, I know that I'm going to die someday, they're speaking in certainty. Undoubtedly, what they say will be confirmed in time, but we don't normally call that foreknowledge. It's awareness of a general truth that human beings are mortal, but it shows no specific knowledge of that person's particular life and death. There must be sufficient detail present in which to convince us this is what we want to call foreknowledge. So if the person says, I know that I'm going to die in March 2015, and if in fact they do, we'll call that foreknowledge. And then, of course, we would be forced to ask what kind of foreknowledge it was, evidence-based, action-based, or whatever. You see the distinction? Now, the reason this is important is because I'm going to systematically go through all three of these criteria in order to argue that there was, in fact, foreknowledge, not just hunches and the rest of it, because NIST will try and make this just as vague as they possibly can. And that's why I want to make it clear. I want to show that there was widespread foreknowledge of World Trade 7's collapse. We'll blank that screen for a moment because I want to discuss some textual evidence at this point. A couple of years ago, I went through the oral histories of the New York firefighters, Actually, this was the second time we've gone through them. There's about 10,000 pages of primary source, extremely valuable documents here. I wanted to see what kind of awareness there was among the firefighters of World Trade 7. And of the 60 firefighters I found who had some clear awareness that it was going to come down, I asked the question, was there uncertainty or certainty? You find both. You find firefighters who say the chiefs were concerned about Building 7, or they thought it might come down. But you also find a really surprising degree of certainty. And so in exploring this first term, this first concept of certainty, I thought it would be worth looking at that material. And slightly over half of the firefighters expressed certainty that they had been told that Building 7 was definitely coming down. Some had been told half an hour before it came down, some an hour before it came down, sometimes 2 hours, and sometimes even 4 hours before it came down. They were told it was definitely coming down, and I thought that was quite extraordinary, especially given the uniqueness of this event. There's another way to approach this topic of certainty. Let me go back to the little analogy of me at the podium. Supposing while I'm talking here, some guys file in, and they're looking bored, and they're looking at their watches and not listening to me. You walk over to them and you say, "What are you doing?" And they say, "We're just waiting for MacQueen to collapse and die, because we've got some things we have to do backstage here. And, we're just waiting for him to get on with it." That would show a high degree of certainty that I was in fact going to collapse and die. Now, why am I bringing up that silly analogy? Well, I'm going to quote you from the testimony of the New York firefighters. Firefighter Burke: "The rest of the day we were unloading trucks. We were just doing whatever little things we could do, but they were waiting for 7 World Trade Center to fall." Donato: "We came around, I think we took Murray Street down the west side. We stopped the rig and pulled over to the side. We all got out of the rig. We were standing, waiting for 7 to come down. We were there quite a while, a couple of hours." Wallace: "They were saying Building 7 was going to collapse. So we regrouped and went back to our rig. We went to the building 4, building 3, I don't know. We're going to set up our tower ladder, but they said no good, because Building 7 is coming down. So we waited for Building 7 to come down." Fortis: "They pulled everyone back. Everyone stood there, and we actually just waited and just waited and waited until it went down." Firefighter Massa: "I remember later on in the day, as we were waiting for 7 to come down, they kept backing us up Vesey, almost like a full block. The whole time while we were waiting, there were hours that went by." Firefighter Pilla: "We walked back. We didn't go any further because building number 7 was coming down. That was another problem, to wait for Building 7 to come down." Strobel: "They had figured, they knew that building was going to come down. It was just a question of time. And everybody was awaiting that." Sweeney: "Once they got us back together and organized, they sent us back down to Vesey, where we stood and waited for 7 World Trade Center to come down." I'm almost done. 2 more. Chief McCarthy: "So when I get to the command post, they had just a flood of guys standing around there. They were just waiting for 7 to come down." And lastly, Assistant Commissioner Drury: "I must have lingered there. There were hundreds of firefighters. They were waiting for 7 World Trade Center to come down." I think even if all we had were those 10 little testimonies, we'd be able to say, oh yeah, people knew it was going to come down. The criterion of certainty has been met. Hundreds of people were standing around. Some of them were there all afternoon, waiting. Not waiting to see if it would come down, waiting for it to come down. And lastly, if you have any doubts still on this issue of certainty, how about firefighter Long? They